Welcome to Badaboom. I'm Chris. On this episode, we have on Diego Valenzuela and Kevin Kleinrock from Mass Republic to discuss Luchaverse Catalyst. Starring Lucha Libre icons Rey Mysterio and Tinieblas Jr., Kevin and Diego talk about how culture and history brought this new comic book universe to life. Luchaverse Catalyst releases July 17th from Massive Publishing. Listen in and bada boom. Hey, Diego and Kevin, how are you?
Hey guys, how you doing? Happy to be here.
Yeah, doing
Good.
well, thanks.
Good. We're excited to talk to you. You guys got some big things coming up at Mass Republic. Next month we're looking at Luchaverse, sort of issue one, sort of kicking off this new Lucha universe with Rey Mysterio. So, what's it been like, sort of putting this all together? I think Massive is doing some really cool things in comic books, and I think right now, as someone that's kind of like stepped away from really watching wrestling and stuff, it's been cool to see the last few years like it pour into comics. Like I've actually been following wrestling in comics more than I've actually been following it on TV and stuff like that. So it's been cool to see people add sort of like their take on it. So what's it been like sort of putting all this together?
So this really started like the journey to get here and the massive release on July 17th that we're super excited about. It really started probably about 7 years ago or so. I knew that for Masked Republic, we wanted to figure out a way to start telling stories of luchadors away from the ring. And we didn't want to make wrestling comics. We wanted to
Yeah.
make comic books that starred luchadors and had them go on their adventures away from the ring, whatever those might be. And a lot of the inspiration is pulled from the classic lucha libre films of the 50s to the 70s, where you had like Santo versus the aliens, or Blue Demon and Santo versus Dracula and the Wolfman. And growing up in LA, I would watch wrestling WWF on Saturdays and Sundays at 12 noon on Fox, and then I'd be flipping channels after, and there were these wacky lucha movies on the Spanish stations. And so from a child, it was always kind of a really cool, just what is this world? The movies back then were kind of like the Batman 60s series here. They're very campy, very cheesy, but super fun of like what these wrestlers did away from the ring. And Master Public in and of itself, we represent a lot of the big name icons and superstars of Lucha Libre for their licensing and merchandising, which is the stuff you see behind me. But we really wanted to figure out, how do we go beyond that? How do we start creating our own Luchaverse, our own storytelling worlds? And what I love about what we've been able to do is it's really, each luchador kind of has their own genre to it. So whereas like Rey Mysterio is an action adventure type of guy, Tinieblas Jr. is more of the horror genre, and it really allows us to build out this really nice fleshed out world that can all come together when necessary and pull apart when necessary. And so, yeah, it was an opportunity to figure out, how do we modernize this kind of lucha libre genre storytelling. And we had put together a number of stories, and then now we're teaming up with Massive to kind of bring those to a much larger audience, and also brought in Diego to take kind of what we had built as the kind of the groundwork, or the catalyst, as we're specifically calling this catalyst because of that, and then pivot it into where we're going in the future with it. And I think it's going to be an awesome ride.
Amazing. That's really cool, and I think it is an opportunity because you see those things, and I feel like, and especially with the luchadors you represent, like Rey Mysterio, they're icons, and they still like feel like in modern times it's hard to sort of have that mystique about you because of like, social media and stuff like that. But even so, with how big he's become, you still have that about him. And I think there is something to be tapped into with those kind of stories because I think these days it's hard to have that mystique around certain people. It seems like people want to break people down and sort of be like, "Oh, you're normal, just like me," and there isn't sort of like that feeling of like, "Oh my God, this person must be like the most interesting man in the world" when they're not wrestling and stuff like that. So just even seeing the covers was really exciting. And like one of the, I don't know if you ever watched The Strain, but like the strain wasn't like particularly great, but I love the aspect of it where they had a luchador that was a vampire hunter on it, and I was like, they should do more with that. So to see what you guys are doing is really exciting.
Yeah, it's right up that alley. And I think that like you brought up an excellent point. I mean, and Ray guest stars in this first issue. Um, and Ray, because he was around for so long and he was in WCW without his mask, yes, there's still a mystique to him. But it's a little bit different. He's also the most recognizable luchador on the planet, which is awesome. But a lot of the other wrestlers that are part of our story world, Tinieblas Jr., Solar, and Super Astro, these are guys that have been around for decades and they have never been seen unmasked. They're for a lot of luchadors, their real names aren't known. There is absolutely, like you said, this mystique about it that everybody knows the Undertaker's not really a dead guy, and now they kind of know him as Mark as he's out there doing spoken word shows.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a mystique about the luchadors, which I think and I'll let Diego talk about this. Like it just gives you so much more to work with because why couldn't these guys end up in these scenarios? Like it just makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And for
that
you,
is
Diego. Yeah. Sorry.
that is true. And like one of the things I like the most about writing these kind of characters in this particular medium is that there is a very obvious connection between luchadores and superhero comics or comics in general. That would be better. Like I love telling this story, but I remember when I was a kid walking down the streets in Mexico City, where if you've ever been here, you will see a lucha libre mask somewhere, like either painted on a wall or on some poster or a flyer or an actual mask for sale at somewhere. But I remember walking down the street and seeing at a newsstand a wrestling magazine featuring Blue Demon on the cover. And the first thing I thought was it was a superhero comic. Like I thought this wasn't a superhero character. But then someone told me, no, no, this is a luchador, and if you want, you can actually go see him wrestle at the arena whenever you want. And that kind of completely blew my mind. So I've always seen luchadores as luchadores. I'm sorry, as the closest thing we have to superheroes. So, with the natural association we have between superheroes and comic books, having luchadors as comic book characters is just natural to me. It's obvious almost. So, it's a lot of fun to really go deep into how far we can go with these stories that are actually being told about real people. Like if you read a Superman or a Batman comic, these are just fictional characters. But when you read this, you will actually that Tinieblas Jr. does exist, and you can actually meet him and shake his hand and take a picture with him. And that is something that's kind of a fourth wall breaking thing that's really cool. Uh, and it's that this mystique is something that the first thing that drew me to the luchador whole thing is the costume and the masks and the capes, and they actually wear those things, and they go out to restaurants to eat, and they actually have these masks. And Santo had this technique to eat or even change his mask without even knowing, never actually removing it, never seeing his face. And it is crazy to me that even today, uh, people like Solar and Super Astro, actually people don't know their faces, and they've been out there, and everybody knows their masks, but nobody knows their faces, and that is just awesome to me. It's genuinely the such a cool real life superhero situation that's not even a fantasy. Like it's not even about a storyline or something that's happening or whether it's fake or not. That part is completely real, and I love tapping into that superhero-ish aspect of it to tell an actual fantasy horror sci-fi story.
That's
Yeah.
really
And
cool and super exciting that like you get to like write these stories for these people that are real, but they also have like this larger than life aspect.
yeah.
And for me, one of the things I'm really excited about like reading one of these comics is like whenever I watch them like wrestling on TV, it always feels like it lives in that moment and it like stays kind of there. So like when I watched it when I was, like a kid, I always have to think back to like, okay, what was it like when I was a kid? And then think of it as like that from that perspective. But for me, whenever I read about something like in a comic book, it's like I can pick that up when I'm 5 or 10 or 20, and I'm like, this is just as fresh as it was at that point in time, and you still get that excitement. So I was curious to know, like, what's that been like to kind of give that level of excitement through these stories you're writing and sharing with a new generation, of readers, but also like an older generation gets to have that same excitement with it as well. And you're like preserving these stories for like years to come too, because you know when I have kids, or when Chris has his kid read one of these comic books, they can be like, wow, that's so cool. And they think it's like exactly new to them, but like, yeah, this came out 20 years ago.
Yeah. So you just said something that was really cool for me, that it actually made me feel like a kid again to read these comics, because like I knew Tinieblas, right? I haven't met him in person. I hope I do soon, but I know him. Like I know who he is, and I've seen him before. And then picking up the book that wrote that Ivan and Marco wrote, uh, and going through it, it was just, I genuinely felt like like a kid reading Batman for the first time. It was just that kind of excitement. And I love saying this, and it's completely it is romantic, and I love, and it is also completely true, that I love having the privilege of kind of being able to give to not only kids, honestly, anyone who reads these comics, uh, the same excitement and the wonder that I got from them, not only now, but when I was a kid as well. So being on the other side of this creative exchange, of this artistic exchange, is such an awesome privilege. And it's one of the most exciting things for me about having the chance to write these stories.
Yeah,
That's
I
awesome.
love what you just said though, because I don't think I've really thought about it that way. Like I've thought about it in terms of we want to create, we're all about creating transmedia brands. And I just said this a little earlier. It's like it's really dangerous, I think, right now, especially in the comic book world, to go out and say, "Oh yes, we want to see this as a TV show or a movie or this or that," because then I think people get very dismissive of what's actually on the page of the comic, right? So our mission first was we have to create kick-ass comics. We have to create awesome stories, great art, put the comic first, and if something else happens, great. But to me, I think what you just brought up that's so cool is that I, I never thought about it. I've been working in professional wrestling since I was 16 years old. This is my 30th year working in pro wrestling. I never really thought about the fact that that really kind of is in the moment. And yes, people might go back and watch their favorite matches or this or that, but what we are creating now, this Luchaverse story world, does become a much more permanent kind of way of storytelling. And so, yeah, I like that's just such a really cool way to think about it that
Yeah.
I haven't even really thought about, and I love that.
Yeah. Yeah, hopefully those Luchaverse covers are up as posters, like Santo movie posters,
We
down the line.
actually there is a variant cover for every issue, not just of the Luchaverse ones, but basically it's going to be kind of part of all the Master Republic comics. But there is a Lucha movie homage poster variant being done for every issue. And there's some really cool stuff.
Yeah, those are the ones I'm probably gonna get for myself. But it's really awesome, and I think especially with luchadores, I think what's really interesting about them, and we've kind of talked about, is just sort of how they have that mystique and sort of how they stand, and I think that's unique. In American culture, we don't really have that anymore. The closest thing we had was Undertaker, and now he's Mark doing podcasts, and closer to his American badass persona, but like the only things we have like that are mostly like children's characters. Like my son really likes Blippy, so like that guy Blippy, he dresses like that all the time, and he'll always be Blippy until 30 years down the line he's doing podcasts about how he hated being in that costume or whatever. But I think it's really, and I remember growing up, being Latino, when I lived in Colombia and Panama with my dad, like watching things like Chavo del Ocho and stuff like that, and just enjoying those things for what they are, and even revisiting them, you're able to. So I think these comics would definitely have sort of that unique space, and sort of the mentality you have is great, because I think where like comics kind of fail these days is that sometimes you could read something and you're like, wait, this feels like a failed movie pitch, or like I'm reading what is going to be a Netflix series, so like why should I be reading this? And I think what it needs to be is a great comic, and that's where sort of manga really supersedes comics these days. It's like, hey, you read a manga, you're like, I don't know how they're gonna film this, but this is amazing. If they if they ever make this into something, like, great, but like even if they made it into an anime, but you read it for what it is, like a manga. And I think hopefully when people get their hands on the comic, they're able to enjoy it for what it is, which is a great comic.
Mhm.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and that's absolutely our goal. Yeah, and I mean, no handcuffs on any of the writers, or artists of, well, listen, we got to make sure that this is, able to, no, like it is make a great comic first. And I think one of the challenges that our writers do have is, because we are working with real luchadors, real people, we also have to be able to capture their tone. We have to deliver something that they're going to be proud of being part of. So those are some unique challenges that we have. But all of our writers have been doing an incredible job of nailing that. Some characters can be more outlandish than others. Rey Mysterio, like, even though these books are mature books because of the level of kind of violence and storytelling, Rey Mysterio is still Rey Mysterio. He's personally not swearing. He's not doing anything that, like, Rey Mysterio wouldn't do in real life. Whereas, like, when you get to issue 3 in Conan, Conan's Conan, and Conan ain't afraid to say anything in real life, and he's not going to be afraid to say anything in the comic book. And so it is, it's funny because, people say that the best wrestlers are when you take your own personality and just amp it up to 11. And now we're going one step further, because now we're saying these wrestlers who are already their personalities amped it to 11. What is the fantasy version of them, And so, whereas Tinieblas Jr., just because of his whole look, and Tinieblas even meaning darkness, and he's this, great kind of iconic mask of gold with this black, nebulous void faceplate. That's just so perfect for horror, and how we can now kind of take him and go in this direction. And surely at the beginning of his father's career as Tinieblas Sr., who actually was in a number of the original Lucha movies, and after El Santo, Tinieblas Sr. was the first luchador in Mexico in the 80s to get his own comic book series. But even then, like, that comic book series, he was known as Captain Adventure, and he went on these wacky, like, space mission stuff. Nothing like the dark horror that we're about to unleash with Diego's writing. So we're really excited about that.
Yeah, and Diego, what's that been like, sort of like crafting these stories and stuff like that? Obviously, growing up in Mexico City, there's a lot of influence around you. So what's it been like to sort of like carry that torch and sort of be that, be sort of like a conduit for these great luchadors, and also to introduce them to a lot of new fans?
I think what you just said is the most important part. What I feel is a privilege, but also kind of a responsibility, because it is part of Mass Republic's mission to kind of bring this the lucha libre isn't just a sport and a spectacle. It's also a very important cultural element of Mexican history. So not, which isn't to say that it's a sensitive topic at all, because we love lucha libre as it is, and there I feel like there is no way to make a wrong representation of lucha libre. But having said that, I do feel like it is really, really cool to find these ways. It is a challenge, but it's a lot of fun to find these ways to make sure it is accessible to someone who's picking up this comic book for the first time. Someone who's never heard of Tinieblas, or even if Rey Mysterio or any of the other characters, and they can pick it up at that moment and follow and get to understand who this character is, and how this character sees the world, and how this character chooses or doesn't choose to fight monsters or other luchadores, or this is a really complex tapestry between these characters, who, as Kevin said, are real people. To bring them onto the page, onto a fantasy setting, and not lose their voice, and not lose what their character represents in and outside of the ring. Like, if Tinieblas is the comic, he should be able to say, yeah, that's me, and that's proudly me, and yeah, that's me fighting a monster, right? That is like the big mission here we have. And it's honestly really, it is a challenge, but I think I like to consider it more of a privilege, because it's I need to make sure that people who know the character, and of course the Tinieblas himself, can read the book and be proud of it and be happy with it, and someone who's never heard of it before does the same. So being accessible, and being true to the story and the character's legacy is a challenge. It's two different things to juggle, and they might feel at odds with each other, but it's a lot of fun. Like, one of the most fun I've had writing this stuff is having these characters interact with one another, and seeing how they bounce off each other, and how some of them get along and how some of them really don't. It's some of the most fun I've had, and it's been a lot of fun to kind of bounce that around with Kevin to see that it works. And I'm so proud to say that I stand by what we made, and it's seeing it finished is just so cool.
So when you guys talked about you're taking the luchadores like attitude and like who they are, they're already up to 11 in the ring, and you're taking them to another level through the comic books, and they're going to be doing a lot of fighting monsters and through this horror stuff. Do you think one day you might hear or see a kid be like, oh, that's the luchador from the comic and he did this, but like they don't think it's the comic, they're like, that's the guy that killed that giant monster, and he's gonna fight this guy in the ring, that guy's not gonna survive, he's never fought a monster. Like, do you think like the comics that you guys are writing, like the art and the story sound like they're going to be, the art looks great, the story sounds like they're going to be epic? Do you think, or is it a goal that like, man, these kids are going to read these and know that like that's who that person is, and it's like the folklore, it's the new folklore for luchadores?
So I want to say, so first off, because these books are mature, hopefully the kids won't be reading them right now. But listen, once you're honestly, not to be anybody's parent here, but these are more, I would say that they're kind of for the most part more what I would call teen, like if going back to manga, right? In manga, these would be like teen plus, right? Like it's not, it's definitely not adult. But it's mature, mostly again because of the violence and kind of the topics and bloody monster guts sometimes, but as a whole, you hit the nail on the head. What Masked Republic is, we have content and development across publishing, television, film, video game, from preschool to adult. And our entire mission is basically to create an entire timeline of however old you are, there's a place for you to jump into the Masked Republic story world. And once you're there, there's hopefully going to be all sorts of ways for you to interact with our story world, whether it's in publishing, whether it's on television, at our live events. And I think that's one of the, I love what you just said. Like, I can absolutely see, if Tinieblas goes to Comic-Con next year, right? I can see some people having no real idea about his history or legacy as a luchador, but someone might be, maybe he's cosplaying as that guy from the comic book. No, dude, that is the guy from the comic book. That's one of the, it's funny because one of the other verticals of Masked Republic is one, we represent talent for their licensing and merchandising, and then we also negotiate for some of the top talent, like their contracts with WWE or AEW or wherever else. And on the merchandising side of negotiating contracts, it's really interesting because a lot of times people, when it comes to like an original idea for a comic book, right? And you might be going to then license it for an action figure or for TV or film or apparel or whatever. There's certain generic lines in contracts and clauses that make sense when the character is completely made up original IP. But when it's a real human being who's always only been known as that human being, I'll give you an example. Like if Tinieblas Jr. was going to go star on like a Disney Channel show, right? There would most likely be a general thing in the contract, in the boilerplate of the contract that was like, the character that appears, we get all rights to forever. And, it's like, you guys don't understand. Like, Batman has been played by Ben Affleck, by Christian Bale, by this person, by that person. The Batman character is property of Warner Brothers. Tinieblas Jr. is property of Tinieblas Jr. No matter where he goes, no matter what he does, that is who he is. And you can't have those rights separate from him. It just doesn't work that way. And so that's kind of a challenge outside of the comic book pages that we have to kind of just make. Oftentimes people will realize it in the end and they'll get it, but they aren't used to thinking about it that way, because even in pro wrestling, right? You go to WWE, yes, every now and then there's a CM Punk or there's somebody else where it's a little bit different these days. But traditionally, right, you go to WWE, they package you as their character that they own. And when you leave WWE, maybe you'll kind of make your own take on it so people know you and know who you are a little bit, but they own that character. And with a lot of the top lucha stars, it's not the leagues that own the characters. They own their own rights and their personas. And so it's great that we get to, go and kind of expand on the mythology of these characters. But yeah, I can't wait for people to kind of, I want the comics to also help get people into Lucha Libre for sure. I want people to understand that like the Lucha style is just much more cool and fun to watch. And maybe just because you don't like pro wrestling, because maybe it comes off as too silly, or maybe it comes off as too scripted for you. Even though it's the irony of Lucha Libre, like in order to pull off some of the great high flying dives and different things that happen in Lucha Libre, it kind of has to be a little bit more scripted than say WWE. But the suspension of disbelief is so much more, because I think a lot of people when they go to Lucha, they see it more like going to this cultural performance, as opposed to going to like lowbrow wrestling. And again, I say that having written wrestling for 30 years. So I definitely hope that we get people who read the comics into Lucha Libre in general. But I can't wait for the day that like a kid comes up and sees one of our luchadors and is like, "Oh, I know you from the comic." That'd be so cool.
I'm glad you explained sort of the weirdness of licensing with wrestlers, because that's something that's always been on my mind, especially when wrestlers go to other promotions and they're like, "Oh, Christian Cage," and stuff like that. So I think that's something that is really cool about luchadors. They're able to own that because we see that in sort of American wrestling where like there's such strict rules about they can't even make money on t-shirts if they wanted to and stuff. So to see sort of like what you're doing in terms of representing them and sort of putting them in different platforms, but also giving them the power to own that is not like, they lose any of those rights, I think is really awesome and speaks to sort of like the significance of sort of what the iconography of their characters are.
Yeah, and I think that like, and times have changed a little bit. Like for example, Dragon Lee is a client of ours. He's been in WWE the last few years, and they brought him in as Dragon Lee, but in his contract it clearly states when he leaves, he's still leaving as Dragon Lee. And so I think WWE is kind of, especially with the luchadors, has come a long way in kind of being willing to. Lince Dorado is another one. Lince Dorado was an independent luchador who went to WWE for a number of years, but they used him as Lince Dorado, and when he left, he got to retain Lince Dorado. So it's been really cool to see WWE kind of give a little bit on that. But the other side is that it's when Master Republic started, really probably about 15 years ago, the very first thing that we did was try to educate luchadors to their IP rights, because in Mexico, it's a very bootleg culture. It's not, I'm not saying it's a good thing or a bad thing. That is the culture. You go to the arena and they're selling your mask and your t-shirts outside the arena, and you're not getting paid for that. It's just part of the culture. And so we wanted to kind of help luchadors know, listen, if you gave people outside of Mexico, let's not worry about Mexico, but outside of Mexico, you have fans. And if you gave them an opportunity to buy officially licensed product, then people are going to buy your products and you can actually make money. And so that's kind of where a lot of the licensing started for us. But even the laws in Mexico are a little bit different. For example, there's a luchador Octagon, who is very, very famous luchador, probably easily one of the 5 biggest luchadors of like the late 80s, early 90s. And there's a law that a court case that happened with him, and the government basically, or the courts ruled, if you become super famous essentially as this character and the world associates this character with you, then the trademark becomes yours. And that would never happen in the United States, right? Can you imagine like if Ben Affleck ended up, getting the rights as Batman, or whatever it would be. So like the company that created Octagon still gets the rights to do like Octagon Junior and Son of Octagon, but Octagon is the only one now that can be Octagon. So it's really interesting, kind of the different philosophies in the different countries and how we have to navigate all that.
Yeah. But in terms of like where Mass Republic is going and what you want fans to look out for in July, and where people can find you, just let the people know.
Yeah. So for Master Republic, we like to keep it simple. It's at Master Republic everywhere. MASKED Republic, and then masterpublic.com. And now we've also got our Master Republic Comics brand, its own website where you can get some. So one of the things that Massive did is normally they don't sell any comics directly to consumer on their website until after final order cutoff or until after the street date. Final order cutoff for issue 1 of Luchaverse Catalyst is June 17th. So like we're right around the corner. But because Massive understood and knew that like maybe a lot of the wrestling fans that would be coming to find this book don't know where their local comic book shop is, don't have a pull list somewhere, they did make some of the covers available now for pre-order directly on the Massive site. So if you do have a local comic book shop and you do have a pull list, which if you're watching, listening to this, you probably do, I encourage you, support your local comic book shop, go out, pre-order it there. But if you don't, then head to the Massive site, which you can also get to through massrepubliccomics.com, and check out some of the covers that we have available there, including the really cool, there's this guy, Andy Bellinger, who I know is a relatively known artist these days. He also happens to be a Canadian wrestler, and he did this incredible Ali versus Superman homage cover with Rey and Tinieblas. So some really cool stuff over there. But Mass Republic Comics, that's where you can find me / the company. And I'll let Diego get in his own social plugs.
So for me, you can just look for Diego Valenzuela pretty much everywhere. I think there is an Argentinian historian who is also named Diego Valenzuela. That is definitely not me. I only write the sci-fi stuff. You can find me as the at the Damn Beast pretty much everywhere, except Facebook, which I do think I am the only Diego Valenzuela there. And I do like promoting everything that's coming for Mass Republic. On comics and on pretty much every end of the spectrum, as well as my own stuff. You can also find some of my other writing, my novels, and all that stuff over there. So yeah, I'm excited to connect.
Sweet. Thank you guys. We really appreciate it. We're both really excited. For me, as you know, someone that grew up with Ray, I'm excited to dive back in and sort of see him as a James Bond figure and fly out of planes and all that. So I'm really excited for that. So thank you
You're
guys. I'm gonna love it. And with that, bada boom.
Bada boom!
Thank you for listening to the Badaboom podcast. Keep the conversation going with Chris and I on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter. You can find us on all these places at Badaboom Podcast. Get into the comments on our YouTube channel. Let us know what you like about the show or what you'd like to hear from us in the future. Until next time, please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen. Thanks for listening.